And we closed our Series A in August 8 of 2008.
Ooh.
So it was literally 2 months before Lehman. We're going up and down the valley. Right? We're based in Silicon Valley and trying to find who would be the early customers.
Yeah. So I have this constant pressure to grow,
Yeah.
burn more, get more customers, but at the same time, I want to build a business that actually makes sense in the long run.
That's right.
Yeah. So,
And it's this hard balance,
Yeah.
right? Nail it before you scale it. Like, what are the things that tell you the underlying model really, really works before you pour it on the gas and scale it? Because those moves afterwards, it's much harder to fix.
hello, everybody. There's no one in the studio but Jim. I'm super excited today. We have Jim Yu, who runs BrightEdge, and you're the founder of BrightEdge, right?
Yes.
I'm really excited to talk to you. I've been following your LinkedIn posts for quite some time now. You have really insightful posts on generative AI implications on search and searchability in the long run, how data moats actually play in SEO. I'm really excited to dive deep into those. But before we do that, I want to learn about you first. So how did you get started? When was the first foray into entrepreneurship for you?
First foray into entrepreneurship, I think it started early. I mean, I think it would be like, mowing lawns, going door to door and, knocking on doors. And I grew up in a trailer park. And so that was a, sort of a unique experience. But then I went door to door, which is pretty easy because the trailers are close by.
Yeah.
And then I would just mow lawns and, $5 a lawn. And that was probably my first business.
That is, let's talk a little bit more about that. So clearly, like your childhood shapes you as a human being a lot. What memories do you remember that inspired you to actually, okay, I think I can mow lawns and get $5. I can take this to 100 next steps. Like, was there a key moment, a light bulb moment, an epiphany that you remember that's like, okay, this is the exact direction I want to go in?
Yeah, I think I think it was when I started programming. I started programming I think I was 7 years old. I got my first computer.
Whoa.
It was 8088, right? It was early generation computing, and it had 2 big floppy drives, and I just fell in love, right? Once that computer came home, I started creating, I started programming. I would stay up. I did my first all-nighters, and my mom would be like, hey, you need to go to bed because you can't stay up. And yeah, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. And I would learn, and I just started to learn to build stuff and create things. And I think as an entrepreneur, one of the things is that passion for creating something. And it's always that struggle of building something, but you get the high from, oh, I've built this. And then when you see it come to life, I think that was a big aha moment for me that was something that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that. I also didn't have like a quote unquote rich childhood.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a computer until I was like 18 years old. And I was doing engineering, computer engineering.
Oh, wow.
Without a computer, I was like reading books.
How did you do that?
Our college had a lab, so you would get like 30 minutes of lab time, 40 minutes of lab time. So you would read your like C, C++, and then you would run the code in the lab.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's like literally writing the code on paper and then running in the lab.
Wow.
But when your code runs for the first time, and if you haven't, like, if you don't
No
have,
core dump.
No, yeah. And I was like, what? Yeah, those things I really miss. Like the kick you get when you create something new. And that extends for companies as well. But that's a common thread among the founders. All the founders that I've spoken with, nobody speaks about, I started this because I wanted to make money. People want to like create new things. Okay, so what inspired you to build BrightEdge?
So BrightEdge, I started BrightEdge, it was kind of interesting. For my day job, this was 20 years ago. I was at Salesforce.com, and I was leading a core part of the platform products there, right? So Salesforce was pushing the idea of delivering enterprise software in the cloud, or software in the cloud, business applications in the cloud. And so during my day job, I was working on sort of parts of what became the App Exchange and Force.com. And it was really exciting, right? But for fun, I'd always built websites. And to get traffic to those sites, I learned about optimizing them, right? That like, hey, and at the time, there was Google was a big search engine, already very dominant, but Yahoo was still a big search engine as well. And so I was optimizing the site, I was getting a lot of traffic. And then I started to connect these dots of like, why aren't companies optimizing their website? Salesforce certainly wasn't optimizing their website. And meanwhile, all these businesses were spending tons of money on digital advertising, paid search, and other types of ads to generate leads. And I was like, why isn't anybody doing the organic side of this? Optimizing their digital presence, making sure they're earning their audience, and making sure they're driving things through just the actual sort of creating the right kind of content and experiences. And so I dug into that and I realized there's this huge opportunity where businesses at that time didn't understand that it was, number one, that it was important.
Yeah.
Right. And number two, how do you even do this? They didn't have the data, they didn't have the technology, the workflow. And so I was like, at the intersection of, sort of software moving into the cloud and everything becoming digital, you had this huge opportunity to go create something that was also partially a technology that I wanted for myself too, right? I think a lot of times as an entrepreneur, you're also creating something that you have a personal sort of affinity to and that you feel this need for, right? And so that's something that I was like, okay, I saw at the intersection of that a huge opportunity.
Yeah. So you quit your cushy job at Salesforce.
That's right. And that was crazy, right? Because my wife and I had just had our baby, firstborn, right? And I remember, tossing and turning and thinking late at night, like, I really have this itch that I want to scratch. I really want to go start a company.
Yeah.
And I remember telling her, and she was very supportive, but it was definitely one of those things where it's like, okay, it's creating a company. Sometimes it's like that. And exactly, you were telling me earlier about your story, right? But for me, it was like, a big part of it is, cutting the line, right? And just going on that ship, right? And seeing where it takes you. And I think that moment is one of those things you always remember, like taking that leap.
Yeah, that is so cool. It's no joke to start a company when you have a newborn. That's crazy. I've seen this thread among the best of the best that there is no plan B.
Mm-hmm.
They usually just cut the rope.
That's right.
Go all in.
Yeah.
Figure out a way how to make things work. But again, we only speak with those people because they are successful.
Mm-hmm.
Like people who don't succeed, we would never know.
That's true.
So our data set is somewhat, or like a mindset.
Selection bias.
Selection bias, yeah.
For sure, yeah.
So that is really cool. So I'm assuming you started by yourself.
I started in the beginning by myself.
Yeah.
And then I found a great co-founder.
Okay, cool. Very similar.
Yeah.
So you started, and how did you go about finding which companies need SEO services, especially in the early days when the market didn't even exist?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I remember going up and down the valley. Right? We're based in Silicon Valley, and trying to find who would be the early customers, right? But we started building technology because, again, it was a need I had, right? Yeah. So I was like, I'm gonna build this huge. One of the first things was like, I got to build this big. If we're gonna help people optimize their website for search, we needed to invent a whole new set of data for helping people understand what is their current presence in search, what are the pages that they have, how do they optimize it. So we created this thing called the data cube. And so during the day, I would be out there trying to find customers, and at night we'd be cranking away on writing code, right? And cutting releases and all this kind of stuff, which is its own kind of context switching day to day. But then, so I started testing out all different types of customers, and then I found that there are these different market sort of opportunities, right? And it actually led me to, at that time, the early generation of Web 2.0 companies. Because at that time, this is in 2007, right? 2007, 2008. Whoa. This was the era of the early social networks, right? Yeah. So you had, all these Web 2.0 companies that were sort of the next generation of the web. And, obviously Facebook emerged as a massive winner in that. Yelp was, was started at that time. But those are the names we know now. back then, there were hundreds of these companies, right? There was I remember we had this one customer that was a social network for pets, for pets. There was a social network for senior citizens. Pretty hard to get senior citizens to become social. And then there was a social network for movie lovers, right? So it was the era of next generation web companies. And the thing that we learned about that was they were the early adopters. And they were the early adopters because they were born online. So they had to get really, really good at digital marketing and search optimization and structuring their websites. And we learned a ton of things. It was amazing. We built a lot of tech, learned a ton.
Yeah.
We built super scalable technology because those sites some of them are massive. The only problem was, 2008 happened and 99% of those companies died, right? So we had all this great technology, all this scale, all this stuff that we invented and created and worked with all these customers on, but there were like 3 big ones left, right? It was like MySpace was a big customer of ours at that time, right? And you know what happened with that story. But they were an amazing customer because they pushed the boundaries with us because the scale that they were at was so big. It was breaking the search engines just because of the number of pages they had. And so we built this large scale technology. We built all this and, sort of created all these cool things. But, we learned about product market fit and finding the ICP and testing systematically different segments of the market and evolving that. And so it kind of was a lot of iteration. But the early customers, long answer to your question, but the early customers became these companies born online that were digital native and were pushing the edge on sort of how you do this stuff.
Very interesting. That must have been a really rough time, 2008.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. But we were really, really lucky because we raised money and we closed our Series A in August 8 of 2008.
Ooh.
So it was literally 2 months before Lehman. I was like, and so that slug of capital, right? And we got great venture investors that backed us with Altos, and then they basically, we raised the money, and then we knew, right? The whole thing that was like there wasn't going to be money for another, like, just the capital markets shut down, right? And it was like there wasn't going to be money for years, and so the good thing about that was, though, it created and cemented the DNA of the company, right? The DNA of the company then got formed in a stage when it was just, you had to make things work.
Yeah.
Right.
And you also have to go towards sustainability as opposed to
That's right.
grow at all costs. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
I personally feel that pressure myself. Like, on one hand, I want to build a sustainable business.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we are somewhere in between seed and Series A. So I have this constant pressure to grow, burn more, get more customers. But at the same time, I want to build a business that actually makes sense in the long run.
That's right.
Yeah. So,
and it's this hard balance, right? And I think a lot of it's like, it's like, nail it before you scale it. Like, what are the things that tell you the underlying model really, really works before you pour it on the gas and scale it? Because those moves afterwards, it's much harder to fix.
Yeah, fair enough. That's absolutely fair. Let's pivot a little bit. So when you started, I'm assuming you had a bunch of startup customers as well as mid-market type companies.
Yep.
You didn't start with Fortune 500 companies, but now majority of Fortune 500 companies are on BrightEdge.
Yes.
How did you make that transition?
Great question. So we tested a lot of different segments, right? And so it used to be every month we would step back and look at all these different test segments. So we tested everything from, startups to mid-market to verticals and then to enterprise. But the way our path to enterprise was kind of interesting. Our path to enterprise actually happened because we started to realize that the way the market would evolve is based on the distance of digital and search to their revenue of the customer, right? And the revenue of that industry. And what became really interesting is the next segment that we figured out that really worked, that made the business, was after the Web 2.0 companies, we had all this great technology that was scaled out, right? And then we started really testing, and then we figured out that the big retailers had a similar challenge, right? They had these huge product catalogs, and they could get tons of revenue from organic search. In fact, they were getting, even then, they were getting more than 100 million a year, hundreds of millions a year from organic search at that time, right? This is 17 years ago, right? Or, roughly. So think about, that was early days, and it was already that big. So we could leverage the scale that we had built with the big social sort of web players, but connect the dots back to revenue. So the main innovation at that time that we added was into our platform, the ability to glue back in the web analytics data that tells you the orders and sales and revenue at a detailed level. So then all of a sudden you could start to connect the dots between the things you were doing in organic search and the uplift that it had on your revenue. And that as changes happen, you could have the analytics to help you understand kind of, hey, this you checked in this change to the site. What does that mean? Did it break something in terms of your revenue? How do you triage that problem? And so we started to figure out that when you have these large retailers, e-commerce players that were generating a lot of revenue from the channel, that was a huge sort of ICP and a very powerful, unique selling proposition. And so we built that technology, we added it into our platform, and then we started basically going down the list of all the top e-commerce and retailers, and just boom, 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 boom. And we started taking it down as a wedge into the market. And that's how we started into the enterprise, right? It's like as we tested out these different markets, and there were a lot of other false starts in there, right? So I'm giving you kind of the highlight is like when we found it, because I remember the moment when we signed one of the biggest retailers in the world, I was like, wow, we have a business. We right? Because there's like, that moment, one of those moments, you're like, okay, I found it. I really found the market and the value prop and the technology fit. Yeah. And then you go in and you really go and crank after that.
Yeah, that's actually was this before Google Analytics?
This was Google Analytics was there for sure already, but most of the large guys did not use Google Analytics at all. In fact, at that time, most of the big retailers, a lot of the retailers used this web analytics platform called Core Metrics, which became a part of IBM. And so it's very, these days it's much more sort of Adobe Analytics or Google Analytics. Yeah. But at that time, the big retailers, a lot of them were using IBM's version.
Very cool. It's so awesome to hear the world shaping because of analytics. And people even me, I just don't think about how that may impact my life.
Yep.
But that literally shapes my life. Every single thing I buy has a slew of analytics that push me towards it indirectly. And learning about the histories about that is so cool. Very cool. I completely lost track of my, I was so engrossed listening to you. I was like, what is my next question here? Let's fast forward a little bit to 2024. What do you see in terms of generative AI impacting the search landscape? And now that ChatGPT and other tools are eating away at the search share of Google, how do you see the role of SEO? So people search because they want to either find something, or they're trying to solve a problem, or they're just are curious.
Yes.
How does SEO play in that role where the answers are given as opposed to you're presented with a list of options that are somewhat curated by the public?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if you look at sort of how the whole industry is evolving around search, I think there's really sort of two big sort of ways to look at this problem, right? Or look at sort of the industry. The first is, what does it mean to search itself, right? How is search changing? How does it evolve from the end user perspective? And then there's the other piece of it, which is consequently, what does that mean for us as businesses, entrepreneurs, and marketers that want to get the next customer or acquire more business, right? So from a perspective of evolution of search, the thing that's really interesting is AI in search is probably one of the biggest changes. The Gen AI portion is probably one of the biggest changes to happen in search in the last decade, right?
Yeah.
And there's a couple big changes here. I think number one, if you play with these models, there's a clear sort of series of use cases that are emerging where the LLM is just really, really good. And what I'd say it's really good at is it's really good at making the average searcher 100 times better at searching.
Yes.
Right? Because what it's doing is the core use case that it's just so good at is it can take a single keyword, right? Let's say I'm looking for golf shoes, and it can actually then span that out into 5 keywords. Like, what should I wear? What's the proper golf attire? What are the things I should look for in a golf shoe, in golf shoes? What are the different types of models, and what are the sort of popular brands? And it does all of that and combines it into a single search, and then gets all the results and summarizes it, right, in a very nice experience, right? So I think that for the end consumer is a huge change in terms of what that means in terms of search. And then what that also means in terms of the overall landscape is you have a huge opportunity for disruption. So you can see a lot of movement happening right now, right? Google's got its effort with Search Generative Experiences, SGE, right, where it's essentially using their AI model and then embedding it directly into search.
Yeah.
You have OpenAI creating their version. They've talked about creating their version of search, and then Microsoft with Bing and Copilot having their version of search. Perplexity, yeah. A lot of stuff happening with Perplexity, very interesting. And so when you look at these different search engines, at the core of it, I think what's really exciting is there's never been a more exciting sort of time of innovation in search, right? And I think what's going to happen is these different search engines are going to be good at very different use cases. They have very different assets. If you look at Google has massive assets. If you want the most real-time index, Google has that. Like, if you want to have the best sort of data around things that are open near you, things that are sort of the reviews around that, summaries of the different types of restaurants, different types of retail locations, Google has, remember, roughly about 35% of searches in that neighborhood has location intent, right? You're looking to go somewhere, you're looking to pick something up, you're looking to go shop somewhere or eat somewhere or go to the movies. All that information requires accurate location information. It also requires accurate sort of hours, accurate sort of inventory, all those type of things. So Google has those assets that they're very, very strong at. That's just one of several. But you have folks like Perplexity, if you look at their approach, they're really gunning after kind of this research use case.
Yes.
There's a portion of search that's about researching things. And if you look at Perplexity's power core in their experience, it's almost like an answers engine for doing research. And they do a beautiful job of citations, right? Citations where it's basically the LLM has to be able to have a source of information. And Perplexity's model gives you a lot of transparency into where is it getting that information. So it actually, just like when you write a good paper, a research paper, right? Where we all remember doing this in college, right? Where you got to go, reference 1, reference 2, reference 3. It does that automatically with the large language model, right? It goes and researches all that information, and then it goes ahead and summarizes that, and it breaks it down and then writes it in a very nice way. So for the searcher, what I think that means is you're going to have different engines that you use likely for different types of things. And we already do this today to some extent, right? Like, how many people search not only on Google, but also search on Amazon for products or search on YouTube for videos, right? So search fundamentally is already somewhat fragmented, right? I think the AI world will continue to do more of that in terms of fragmentation, that you'll use different AI for different aspects of what you do today for search.
It's a very interesting and real take on this. the intent for search is different, and people use different applications for that. One of the things when I used to work at Google, people talked about was how Google Shopping couldn't compete with Amazon.
Yep.
And the mind space for shopping, how is it different, and how Amazon actually created a really strong brand positioning and mind space
Yes.
for search. I'm really curious to see, and I don't think anybody can answer this, how say ChatGPT or Claude, or which are tools that become like the go-to source for skill or answer-based, like the knowledge type search. I really want to see what mind space it takes in a user's or the population's mind. 'Cause Amazon shopping, Yelp food, well, Yelp and Google for food and restaurants, Google for location or just curious questions, what have you. I don't know what's next. You know what I mean? Like, what would people think when they think about ChatGPT 5 years from now? Because I'm pretty sure they're not going to think about Google search when they do use ChatGPT.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's some hints of what will happen, right? Like if you look at sort of ChatGPT, the power core, the superpower of ChatGPT is actually creation.
Yeah.
It is so good at creating content, right? It's better at creation than research because the research aspect requires a lot more of a real-time index. That good research for a lot of categories of research, whether it's even if you have this question, we were playing with a lot of, because we look at our data cube, which looks across all these different keywords and topics, and then we look at this across these different engines. And so one example is if you just ask a question like, what's the interest rate, right? Everybody wants like, right?
Yeah.
What's the inflation? What's the interest rate? That you need real-time information. You like that. The moment it gets published, you want to have that information, right? You can't have a stale index for that. The moment you want to know, hey, where should I go to grab a good burger right now? You need like real-time information, right? So there's certain use cases that in search require that real-time information. And then, so research is definitely one of those things in a lot of categories. Whereas ChatGPT creation is amazing, like, and it's getting better and better and better at creation, right? So I think there's these different categories of use cases where each of these models will actually kind of have core differentiated capabilities. So that's one part, is the model. The other piece that's playing out that I think is sort of this battle that's super interesting is these frontiers of kind of what I think of like prime real estate of information, right? So if you look at sort of the Reddit, the Reddit filing when they went public, they had a $200 million 3-year deal.
Yes.
It's like a brand new revenue stream, right? By licensing their data to train the LLMs. Well, who's licensing it? Well, it's going to be people like companies like Google, right? So the other battleground that's happening right now is who has access to some of this curated, high quality, live kind of training sort of data and information. That aspect is going to be another sort of important part of the battleground as well. And so we have this thing where we built this technology in our labs called the BrightEdge generative parser. So what it's doing is it's in the past it used to be, we had parsers that would do just kind of parse through text, right? Then we created this visual parser, right? Because it would render the page and understand sort of things sort of from a visual context of what it looks like for a user. So parsing that with technology. Now we created this generative parser where it actually interacts with the AI to look at sort of what are the responses coming back. And what's fascinating is when you look at these different search engines and we point our generative parser at it and do an apples to apples comparison, we see all kinds of interesting dynamics. And I'll give you one nugget. What we saw as an example is that more than half of the citations, right, in Perplexity includes things from the first page of Google. So think about that, right? So it's from to bring to the second piece of what does it mean for marketers. You need to continue to win, whether it's in ranking on page 1 as a concept or being the cited authority and source for the AI, being the original source,
the authority.
being the authority. That concept remains more relevant and more important than ever, right? And that is the next frontier of optimization, and it continues to be. And the good news is, if you're already doing well, right, and you already are an authoritative source on page one, well, look, the models will have to continue to reward and cite and get information from the right source. So I think a lot of this evolves towards, from a marketer perspective, from an entrepreneur's perspective, what is your superpower as a company, and what do you have a right to win, right? What content are you going to put out there where it's just natural for you, right? Where you have a right to win in that area, and then you are the cited source. Whether it's Google's AI engine or Perplexity's AI engine, right? If somebody's searching around basketball shoes and how to pick the best basketball shoes, and they want to know about the latest innovation around, basketball shoes to have better performance, well, Nike is a great source for that kind of information, right? They should create content around that. They have a right to win in that, right? They've probably done a lot of innovation and research on the next generation of performance in basketball shoes for each of the positions, whether you're playing a guard or a center, right? They are probably doing the leading research on that, right, as they build their products. And so they have a right to win in that. They'll create content around that. And ultimately, that will be the next frontier of how you win, I think, in SEO.
That is very, very insightful. It's doubling down on your core competency, knowing your superpower, and then being the authoritative voice in that. I'm assuming there's other elements, other vectors as well, like freshness of the content, like that, that come into picture.
Absolutely.
But as we actually turn into, let's talk a little bit about the Reddit IPO actually. How do you see content moderation come into play, especially when you're selling the data set or licensing? How do you see Reddit actually police the data? Because Reddit is notoriously bad, well known for not having good type of content, but it's indexable. So people still find hacky ways to use Reddit to be on the first page. How do you see Reddit actually deal with content moderation when it comes to licensing their data sets?
I think that's going to be one of the big challenges, right? I think it's interesting because for the LLMs, one of the hardest things I think is figuring out, a long time ago, Google had this thing in their algorithm, right, called query deserves freshness, right? And then there's another one called query deserves diversity, right? So two different concepts, right? One, which you just talked about, freshness, right? Like you got to update the content. It has to be relevant for the moment, right? And that's where that portion of the algorithm is dealing with that. Query deserves diversity is trying to figure out, when you do a search, right, in the model of classic search, right, where the searcher kind of gets 10 results or some number of results, it wants to surface different kinds of perspectives, different types of information, so that then you can make the decision of what you're going to decide and figure out, right? So query deserves diversity. In the LLM world, it's going to be interesting on how they deal with this, right? Because the beautiful thing about the LLM, this is something that we saw, that was one of the things that was eye-opening for me, was that the AI engine behind search, for the first time in the history of search, starts to assert an informed opinion, right? And actually, if you look at Google's version, it starts to create pros and cons, right? Which is kind of interesting. Pros and cons of a product, pros and cons of a company, pros and cons. That's kind of interesting, right? Like the AI is actually deciding this is what's good, this is what's bad, right? It also, a big eye-opening moment for me is when I was starting to play with this. I give this as an example of how much things are going to change. Is I was searching, we were looking at the data from our parser and looking at BMW X3. When you search for BMW X3, what shows up in the LLM version is it summarizes it and says, hey, the performance is great, but it's expensive to maintain. The parts are a little hard to find, and it's not that comfortable, right? Now imagine your BMW spending $300 million a year on advertising, And then somebody goes and searches for your product. And now it pulls these things, right? Which is an informed opinion. It's pulling it, I think, from like different kinds of reviews and car and driver. But now the buyer's consideration set is going to fundamentally change,
Yes.
right? And so you have this AI model that's now starting to assert an opinion.
Opinions.
So to bring it back to the Reddit thing, I think it's kind of interesting, right? How is it going to figure out, how is the LLM, it's going to source lots of different perspectives and opinions. How is it going to figure out when to make something a pro and when to make something a con, when to make something positive versus something negative, and how much of it is query deserves fresh diversity, where in the past they're not taking opinion, so they're just surfacing stuff. So it's up to you. Whereas if they're now creating an opinion, wow, that starts to get hard. And we've seen sort of some of the challenges with that, right? Like Google's gotten into some hot water about this stuff, right, with Gemini. And I think that is kind of the challenge with the AI models.
It's going to be really interesting to see. Maybe like Grok or Reddit, Twitter specifically. It's because they are somewhat of an open language platforms for people to say anything they want.
Mm-hmm.
Any LLMs or anything trained on that data set is bound to have quote unquote opinionated outputs.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to see what's going to happen like next. Anyway, we're almost at time. Maybe like 10 more minutes.
Okay.
Let's pivot one more time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember any early advice that you from your early mentors that you still live by today? Do you want to share that with the world?
Yeah, I think that probably it's probably one of the most important things is always have kind of a beginner's mind, right? I think I've always remembered that I got that advice, and I always remember that, because in every phase of the company's journey, whatever you're facing, right? If you can have that freshness of a beginner's mind, right? That's a very powerful thing. Right?
How do you maintain that? Because I find myself losing that over time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you live in one place and then you get used to it. I feel like that at work at times. So how do you actually keep that?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of that, and I struggle with that a lot as well. And I think a lot of it is, how do you manage your cadences, right? And what I mean by that is, as you get your company going, you start to fall into a rhythm, right? And it's good. You want to run things with a certain cadence, right? So for me, I divide up my calendar into what I do on Mondays with, management meetings and one-on-ones, to when I do my sales forecasting and revenue and things like that, versus when I do products and technology, when I do customer success. So each day has a theme. But as you start to do a lot of running, right, what you stop doing is a lot of building. So there's this balance of what percentage of your time are you just running and what percent of the time are you building. And I think the building part, you have to dedicate other rhythms and cadences to. So you're forcing yourself on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis. You're stepping back and looking at that. I still, every Saturday, I still get together with my co-founder and we take a step back and we look at the business and we think about, what are we doing well? What do we need to evolve? And then we continue. We've done that for the last 17 years.
Great.
And that forces a certain level of discipline around freshness of thinking, stepping back. It doesn't mean we do a great job of this, but at least dedicating the time where it's out of the day-to-day fire drills and the day-to-day running of the business to actually build the business, right? And so that ratio of how much of your time are you spending running versus how much of the time are you spending building? Because the building part is what's going to help you reflect and then have a bit of that beginner's mind. And I'd also say, like, the beginner's mind, a lot of that stuff is also look for outside perspectives, right? The answer is in the market. There are other things that people have tried and done that if you are able to benefit from what you see out there, then you can save yourself a lot of time and energy.
Okay. Very cool. I will start experimenting with cadences myself. Do you keep the company accountable, or does the company keep you accountable?
I think it's both, right? And I think it's that you have to drive and keep the company accountable for driving those. A lot of it's like driving those operational execution, right? It's the cadences are really good. The day-to-day cadences are pretty good at driving operational rigor and keeping the company accountable. What's hard about the company keeping you accountable is how you're navigating the company strategically, right? Because are you, from a big picture perspective, continuing to guide the company to where it needs to go? And you feel this as a founder, right? Because you know, you're always kind of, your mind is running 10 steps ahead of where the company currently is, right?
Yeah.
And almost your job becomes about making sure the company is accountable for executing, right? But you're still running ahead, and you're thinking about where's the puck going, right? And then that's what the company needs to keep you accountable for, because if you do a good job of that, the company will thrive, right? And that's hard. That's the balance of it all, right?
And that's the fun of it as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
One last question, probably the most important one. You've built an amazing company, and obviously running it for a long time. What legacy do you want to leave behind?
I think if there's a legacy I can leave behind, I think it's that it's really sort of, I really enjoy sort of building things, right? And if I can continue to build and I can help others build, I think that would be amazing. I think, like, we were just at this conference. I really enjoyed connecting with other founders and builders of businesses. I think it's one of those things where it's such a rewarding but very hard journey. And the thing I said yesterday was, like, it took me more than 15 years to build BrightEdge to north of 100 million. If I can just help somebody save a year or two in that journey, it will have all been worth it, right? And so I think it's building.
Amazing. That is really amazing. My God, that was great. I feel like I can talk to you all day, but
Well, this is great.
we're at time, unfortunately. Thank you so much for giving me your time. I learned a ton, and just listening to your perspective on things, not just tactical, but also looking at yourself, getting together with your co-founder every single Saturday and stuff like that. So it's very, very, there's things for me to, like, grow as a person now after talking to you. So thanks a ton, and I'm gonna hit the stop button.
Great, thanks.
Now.
Thank you.
Let's see if this works.